The 9,479th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and past practice, I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in this meeting. There being no objection, it is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. Members of the Council have before them document S/2023/876, the text of a draft resolution submitted by Malta. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor. I give him the floor.
Господин председатель, господин председатель, господин председатель, господин председатель.
Mr. President, before the members of the Security Council move to vote on the Maltese draft, we would like to propose an oral amendment to the operative part of the resolution. We propose that we add a new paragraph 3 bis with the following content.
Further calls for an immediate, durable and sustained humanitarian truce leading to a cessation of hostilities. I would request the conference officers to distribute to circulate the text of the oral amendment among the members of the Council. I would request to circulate it among all members of the Council.
This text is well familiar to members of the Security Council. The wording we are proposing literally repeats the first operative paragraph of the 26th of October General Assembly resolution adopted during its 10th emergency special session by an overwhelming majority of votes, the resolution Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations. Distinguished colleagues, our proposal doesn't contain anything unexpected for you. From the very beginning of the crisis, we have been saying that in the conditions of the growing number of victims among the civilian population before our eyes, the main aim is to achieve a ceasefire and an end to violence. This has repeatedly been stated by the group of Arab states, including in what was adopted following the recent League of Arab States OIS summit, a statement adopted there. If this provision is not included in the text, one may get the impression that the UN Security Council is happy to make do exclusively with Israel's provision at its own discretion of humanitarian pauses. From our discussions with an overwhelming majority of colleagues, we know very well that that's not the case. Unfortunately, the United States this entire time has consistently blocked any, even the weakest reference to this aim, even allusions to the fact that the Council should return to the discussion of this matter. I would like to ask our American colleagues, during work on the Maltese draft, you struck out anything that could in any way indicate the need for a cessation of hostilities. Does this mean that you are in favour of the war in the Middle East continuing indefinitely? We do not believe that on this matter the UN Security Council should act at the behest of the United States. Our amendment calling for a humanitarian truce is consistently along the lines of the aim of the stated aim of the authors of the text to preserve its purely humanitarian nature. This is the lowest common denominator, lower than which the Council simply cannot allow itself to fall, particularly against the backdrop of the monstrous humanitarian situation in Gaza and the incoming reports of the Israeli armed forces storming Al-Shifa hospital. Today, strikes were launched on 2 UNRWA schools. Our duty is to save the lives of civilians who have a lethal threat hanging over them. I hope that you all share that position. I would also like to recall that the majority of Council members, namely the delegations of Russia, China, Brazil, Ecuador, France, Gabon, Ghana, Malta, Mozambique, Switzerland, and the United Arab Emirates, have already voted previously in the General Assembly in support of the wording we are proposing today. We call upon members of the Council to support it here as well. Thank you.
Colleagues, as the representative of the Russian Federation just introduced, before the Council members is an amendment to S 2023/876, which is the draft resolution submitted by Malta. According to Rule 36 of the Provisional Rules of Procedure, if an amendment adds to or removes from the draft resolution, then the amendment would be put to the vote first. Therefore, I intend to put the proposed amendment to the vote first. Will those in favor of S 2023/876, the amendment to it, please raise their hand. Those against, please raise their hand. Abstentions, please raise their hand. The result of the voting is as follows: 5 votes in favor, 1 vote against, 9 abstentions. The proposed amendment is not adopted due to not getting the required number of votes. It is my view that the Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution containing document S/2023/876 submitted by Malta. The Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution before it. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements before the vote. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. The humanitarian crisis which continues to unfold in Gaza ever since the horrific terror attacks of 7th October is deeply troubling. On that day, children were killed and taken hostage. Since then, over 4,600 are reported to have been killed in Gaza. Around 1,500 are considered as missing. Many are likely trapped underneath the rubble. The lives of newborn babies and premature babies at Al-Shifa Hospital are in grave and imminent danger. Countless civilians are now suffering the scourge of hostilities and all the devastating consequences that armed conflict brings with it. Over 1 million people are displaced. More than half of them are children. Last week, the Secretary General stated, and I quote, "Gaza is becoming a graveyard for children," end quote. This stark warning must not go unheeded. On this occasion, we also pay tribute to all UN staff on the ground for their heroic efforts and remember those who have paid the ultimate price. President, this draft resolution we have in front of us today seeks to offer hope in this dark hour. It aims to ensure a respite from the current nightmare in Gaza and give hope to the families of all victims. It focuses in particular on the plight of children trapped in the war enclave and of those being held hostage. Over the past week, we have held extensive consultations with Council members, interested parties, countries in the region, and humanitarian organizations. We did this in an effort to achieve a balanced and operational text that can address one part of the current crisis, the immediate needs of the affected children. We thank them all for engaging with us in an open and constructive manner. Our guiding light throughout this process was to make sure that the text remains focused and humanitarian in scope. This draft resolution provides for the establishment of urgent and extended humanitarian pauses and corridors throughout the Gaza Strip for a sufficient number of days. Such measures would enable the full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access. It would facilitate the continuous, sufficient, and unhindered provision of essential goods and services important to the well-being of civilians, especially children. It would enable urgent rescue and recovery efforts, including for missing children in damaged and destroyed buildings, and the medical evacuation of sick or injured children and their caregivers. The text also underlines and reiterates the special vulnerable status of children. It calls for the safe and unconditional release of hostages, especially children, that are being held by Hamas and other groups. This, too, is a clear humanitarian imperative which cannot be ignored. We stress that international humanitarian law provides general protection for children as persons taking no part in hostilities. They enjoy special protection as persons who are particularly vulnerable, and we recalled that the taking of hostages is prohibited under international law. President, our votes today translate into real human lives, the lives of thousands of children, civilians, and heroic humanitarian workers. Today, the Security Council has the opportunity to reaffirm its responsibility and commitment to the safeguarding of civilian lives. We need to do this as a matter of urgency. Malta remains steadfastly committed to the protection of civilians, in particular children. They are suffering disproportionately in this conflict. We cannot close a blind eye to their suffering. In this spirit, I urge all Council members to support this draft resolution and to vote in favour of this text. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. President. The war on Gaza has raged for 40 days. While we have held several meetings, heard devastating briefings, and seen heart-wrenching reporting, this Council has been unable to produce anything that would alleviate the suffering of the civilians in Gaza. Outside this building, and in our region in particular, the Council appears indifferent to the carnage and dismissive of the suffering. Due to Malta's extraordinary efforts and to that of their team, which we thank them for, and with our full support as the Arab member on the Council, today we have an opportunity to begin changing that perception. The draft resolution is born from the idea that we must come together now to act under one fundamental common aim. The protection of children has been the North Star that has guided this Council's approach on this draft and brings us together today to vote on the text before us. And as Ambassador Vanessa Frazier has just said, the key elements of this resolution and what they mean in practice for the people of Gaza must not be underestimated. For the children and other Palestinians sheltering from the hostilities, for the Israeli children and others still held hostage, and for UN humanitarian and medical workers who are risking their lives to help alleviate the enormous humanitarian suffering on the ground. This text is also what humanitarian actors have consistently called for as the bare minimum for them to be able to do their life-saving work. The resolution means in real time enough time and space for search and rescue operations to save those children who are buried under the rubble, including the 1,500 who have been reported missing there. It means that fuel, food, water, medicine, and other essential goods can be delivered at scale. It means that sick and injured children can be evacuated. These extended pauses will also help reach those held hostage, particularly children whose release this resolution calls for unconditionally. In addition, the text is unequivocal in its demand that all parties to the conflict comply with their obligations under international law. Through this text, the Council also rejects the forced displacement of Palestinians. This is essential. 2/3 of the population in Gaza are Palestinian refugees who have already suffered from the consequences of forced displacement in their past. And once again, in the last 40 days, nearly 80% of those living in Gaza have been uprooted again. Finally, with the call in this resolution for the Secretary-General to bring options to the Council for the monitoring and reporting mechanisms in this text, we can aid the intention of this resolution to create the space needed for humanitarian actors to do their work. Mr. President, this resolution is a first, important, and overdue step by the Council, and it is for these reasons that we will vote in favour of it, and it has the support of my group. However, the UAE remains resolute that we must work towards a lasting humanitarian ceasefire. We must not lose sight of this urgent goal. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the UAE. I shall now put to the vote the draft resolution contained in document S 2023/876. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2023/876 please raise their hand? Those against, please raise their hand. Abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows. In favor, 12. Against, 0. Abstentions, 3. The draft resolution has been adopted as Resolution 27/12, 2023. I shall now give the floor to those council members who wish to make a statement after the vote. I first give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Over the past month, the world has watched with understandable frustration and increasing concern as this council has been unable to speak out on this pressing matter of international peace and security. And it was not for lack of trying. We got very close last month when the United States put forward a strong and balanced resolution that would have been adopted if not for vetoes by Russia and China. And honestly, I think many had given up hope that we would ever speak on this conflict. But that's exactly what we just did. We got this done because most of us worked constructively in good faith to adopt a resolution. And I want to thank Malta and other members of this council for leading this initiative. At the top, I want to say that I'm horrified that a few members of this council still cannot bring themselves to condemn the barbaric terrorist attack that Hamas carried out against Israel on October 7th. What are they afraid of? What is stopping them from unequivocally condemning the actions of a terrorist organization that is determined to kill Jews and that gunned down civilians, burned families alive, and executed children? A group that killed and took hostages, including children, from over a dozen countries, including the United States. There's no excuse for failing to condemn these acts of terror. Let's be crystal clear. Hamas set this conflict in motion because Hamas only cares about the death and destruction of the Israeli people. They do not care one whit about the safety and the protection of the Palestinian people. If they did, they wouldn't use civilian infrastructure, residential buildings, schools, mosques, and hospitals to store weapons and operate command and control nodes. They wouldn't use innocent, vulnerable people as human shields. Ultimately, the United States could not vote yes on a text that did not condemn Hamas or reaffirm the right of all member states to protect their citizens from terrorist attacks. The Council repeatedly has made clear that we stand against all acts of terror. This horrific attack must be no exception. And the United States will continue to urge this Council to condemn Hamas's actions. Although the United States is deeply disappointed by what is not in this text, we support many of the important provisions this Council has adopted. For starters, while this text does not include a condemnation of Hamas, this is the first time we have ever adopted a resolution that even mentions the word Hamas. In addition, we fully support this resolution's call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other groups. This is a humanitarian imperative. We're working tirelessly to facilitate the safe return of all hostages, including 9 missing Americans and 1 permanent U.S. citizen. We have also advocated for humanitarian pauses to allow for full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access to civilians in Gaza. While we've made some progress in ramping up the flow of humanitarian assistance to Gaza, much more aid is urgently needed. The current levels are woefully insufficient. We continue to work tirelessly to increase deliveries of aid, and we're hopeful that humanitarian pauses will help the UN and humanitarian partners deliver aid and enable the safe passage of civilians fleeing violence. Colleagues, we've been clear as to our expectation that parties to the conflict will comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law. And for Israel, this is an added responsibility, as Hamas has deeply embedded itself within the civilian population in Gaza. But we've been clear at the highest levels. Hamas's actions do not lessen Israel's responsibility to protect innocent people in Gaza. At the end of the day, this all comes down to one clear, urgent goal: to save innocent lives. The toll this conflict has taken on civilians is tragic. The loss of every single innocent life is devastating. And we grieve for all those who've been killed, Israelis and Palestinians, men, women, children, and elderly people. People of all nationalities and faiths, and more than 100 UN staff, and the families and loved ones of UNRWA workers caught in the crossfire. Over the past few weeks, I've spoken with humanitarian leaders who have teams in the region, and I've heard time and time again that while humanitarian workers are exhausted and oftentimes in grave danger, they are determined to fulfill their life-saving mission. And I'm in awe of their bravery. Humanitarians are putting themselves in harm's way to save lives, but they should not have to, because they should be protected. All civilians should be protected. That means Hamas must stop using people, including hospital staff and patients, as human shields. These are acts of unthinkable cruelty and cowardice. That also means that as Israel exercises its right, and indeed its responsibility, to protect its people from acts of terror, it must do so in a way that is consistent with the laws of war. And I want to be clear, the United States does not want to see firefights in any hospitals when innocent people, helpless people, sick people are trying to get medical care they so desperately need. Patients and the people who care for them must be protected, full stop. Colleagues, ultimately, while this resolution is a step forward, its adoption alone will not save lives. And that is why, from the very start, President Biden and Secretary Blinken have worked exhaustively with the United Nations and other humanitarian agencies alongside our regional partners to respond to this crisis. To save lives, we all need to support the heroic efforts of the UN and other humanitarian workers in Gaza. And we all need to work with partners in the region to secure the release of all hostages and prevent this conflict from spreading. As we do so, we believe we must also start to look to the future and lay the groundwork for a sustained peace. This must put the Palestinian people's voices and aspirations at the center of post-crisis governance in Gaza. It must include Palestinian-led governance and Gaza unified with the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority. It must include a sustained mechanism for reconstruction in Gaza, and it must ensure there is no use of Gaza as a platform for terrorism or violent attacks. And it must include a pathway to a two-state solution. I know it's hard to see that brighter future in this moment of darkness, but we must. We have to. It breaks my heart that we will never be able to bring back the children who have lost their lives, or erase the trauma Israeli and Palestinian children living under this conflict are experiencing. As we speak, Palestinian children are fleeing the fighting in Gaza, crying out for help. As we speak, Israeli children, including a 3-year-old American, are being held hostage by Hamas. And Israeli children have been displaced from their homes, which are also under rocket attack. Colleagues, for this generation of children and for the next generation, we have a responsibility to strive for a brighter future for them. And we must ensure Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side in states of their own with equal measures of security, freedom, opportunity, and dignity. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you. Now I give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Monsieur le Président, le Gabon vient de...
Mr. President, Gabon has just voted in favour of the draft resolution submitted by Malta to indicate its support for the Palestinian and Israeli peoples and its commitment to peace. I am delighted that our Council has been able to reach consensus, thus foregrounding the best interests of these two peoples. With this vote, my country reaffirms its support for any initiative that allows for the saving of human lives, in particular the lives of children, in accordance with international humanitarian law. This ensures general protection for children as persons not participating in hostilities and special protection as particularly vulnerable persons, while at the same time recalling that hostage-taking is prohibited under international law. In doing so, Gabon wants to contribute to improving the fate of children on the basis of the relevant elements contained in the resolution that has just been adopted, put to a vote today. Namely, the demand that all parties protect civilians, in particular children that pay a heavy price in this conflict, respect for international law, including international humanitarian law, the call for urgent and extended humanitarian pauses and corridors throughout the Gaza Strip, the call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other groups, especially children, the call upon all parties to refrain from depriving the civilian population in the Gaza Strip of basic services and humanitarian assistance indispensable to their survival, including children. The importance of coordination, humanitarian notification, and deconfliction mechanisms to protect civilians and facilitate the movement of humanitarian convoys and patients, in particular sick and injured children and their caregivers. We are aware that the text presented does not take into account all of the legitimate concerns in such circumstances, but it undoubtedly represents major progress that could make a difference on the ground. However, far from resting on our laurels following the adoption of this resolution, we certainly must show greater engagement to make a just contribution commensurate with our mandate to humanitarian distress. We must show greater engagement to silence the guns and establish responsibility. Once again, Gabon calls upon all parties to show restraint and respect their obligations under international humanitarian law. We will never stop repeating that the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a political one. Diplomacy, negotiation, and dialogue are the only weapons that the international community has to make sure that the legitimate concerns of each of the parties are respected, that is to say, self-determination and the right to security, and to ensure the peace and security of the Palestinian and Israeli peoples. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Gabon. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. President, it is impossible to comprehend the pain and the loss that Palestinian civilians are enduring too many civilians, including, most tragically, children, are losing their lives. So it is right that the Security Council calls for a humanitarian pause for a period of days, long enough to get life-saving aid to those who need it, and to establish a safer environment for humanitarians. This will save lives. We need a collective effort to get aid in as fast as possible, by as many routes as possible. The UK Prime Minister has been very clear about the need for life-saving aid to reach civilians in Gaza, including food, water, medical supplies, and fuel as a priority. For our part, the UK has doubled our aid to help civilians in Gaza. 3 British RAF flights have delivered life-saving humanitarian aid and enabling equipment to support the Egyptian Red Crescent Society in delivering international aid through the Rafah checkpoint. We are urging, and I urge here today, that the priority must be improved land access, including at Kerem Shalom, so aid can get in at scale. All parties must give civilians the protection that is their right under international law, including international humanitarian law. That includes respecting the sanctity and protection of hospitals. It is also right that this resolution calls for the immediate and unconditional release of Israeli hostages. It is unconscionable that Hamas continues to hold men, women, and children, causing terrible fear and suffering for their families. President, this resolution is absolutely necessary, though the UK regrets that the first resolution passed by this Council on this matter could not clearly condemn Hamas terrorist attacks of the 7th of October. The barbarity of those attacks should be clear to us all. That is why we have abstained today. But let me be absolutely clear. It was vital and overdue for the Council to speak on this crisis, and we strongly support the resolution's purpose to get aid in and hostages out. I therefore commend Malta's astounding work in bringing this resolution that could pass. We will continue to work with Council members to resolve this crisis and to create a new political horizon so that we can deliver on the promise of peace for Israelis and Palestinians and make the two-state solution a reality. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. Now I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, France would like to thank Malta for preparing this resolution. We are pleased that this Council is able to speak with a single voice for the first time since the barbaric terrorist attacks committed by Hamas and other terrorist groups against Israel on the 7th of October. France voted in favour of this resolution, which calls for the establishment of urgent and extended humanitarian pauses and also calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other terrorist groups. France voted in favour of this resolution because The humanitarian situation in Gaza is already catastrophic. France is fully mobilized to respond to the urgency of the situation. We took the initiative of an international humanitarian conference for the civilian population in Gaza, which was held in Paris on the 9th of November under the auspices of the President of the Republic and the Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs. The resolution adopted mentions several essential needs: food, water, fuel, and medicines, which must be delivered to the civilian population in Gaza. France recalls its call for the opening of unhindered, lasting humanitarian access that allows humanitarian assistance to reach them in sufficient quantities. Additional efforts must be made. We must also mobilize sufficient resources. France has already deployed more than 100 tons of humanitarian goods and brought its humanitarian support to 100 million euros. However, France deeply regrets that several essential messages are not included in this resolution. This Council must, therefore, as agreed and right away, continue its work to achieve a broader expression. It must unequivocally condemn the terrorist attacks by Hamas. It must recall Israel's right to defend itself and to protect its population, and the duty to do so in strict and absolute respect of international humanitarian law. It must call for an immediate and lasting truce that could lead to a ceasefire and call for avoiding regional spillover. The Council must lastly recall that there is a need for a decisive relaunching of negotiations to achieve a two-state solution on the basis of agreed parameters, the only thing that will allow Israelis and Palestinians to live in peace and security. This Council cannot and must not remain silent on these elements. It must be demanding and be up to what is at stake in this crisis that was triggered on the 7th of October by the Hamas attacks. France will continue to engage resolutely in the negotiations with all of the members of this Council. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Mr. President, we voted in favor of this draft resolution because it contains elements that are very urgent and relevant in the face of a situation that is increasingly grave and is of great concern for the international community and for all members of the Council. Inter alia, the text reaffirms the obligation to uphold and respect all obligations pursuant to international law, international humanitarian law, human rights law, and international humanitarian law. And the text in particular stresses the situation of children, which is one of the groups most affected by violence. The text requests for the establishment of pauses and humanitarian corridors to allow for full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access, both for supplies and for rescue. It also calls for the immediate release, an unconditional release of hostages taken by Hamas and other groups, and to guarantee humanitarian access to them. It also requests the Secretary General to provide an oral report on the implementation of the resolution and to identify monitoring options. Indeed, the draft that we have adopted focuses on humanitarian needs that are urgent due to the grave conflict in Gaza that was unleashed following the terrorist attack by Hamas on the 7th of October. And it is an essential first step by the Council. The Council will have to continue to work on other aspects of the conflict. Colleagues, we consider that the general text elaborated by the E10 is a valuable starting point, but our work must continue. Ecuador abstained in voting on the amendment presented this afternoon because we consider that the draft that we have just adopted must be preserved, a draft that is the outcome of a negotiating process in which all members of the Council participated. Lastly, we would like to thank and congratulate those who have led this negotiating process, in particular Malta, and we also would like to acknowledge those who have demonstrated flexibility to avoid a veto, which would have been extremely damaging for the future consideration of this topic by the Security Council. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. For nearly 6 weeks, this Council remained silent as the conflict worsened to an unprecedented degree. Today, at last, we were able to act. Japan was pleased to vote in favor of this resolution, and we are grateful to Malta for taking the initiative to help finally craft a balanced text that could be adopted. This resolution emphasizes the need to protect civilians, especially children, who should never be targeted and who have been disproportionately affected both by the conflict and by the rapidly worsening humanitarian situation in Gaza. It is important that the resolution calls for urgent and extended humanitarian pauses and corridors throughout the Gaza Strip, and for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other groups. In this context, Japan highly appreciates ongoing diplomatic efforts made by key actors, including the United States. Mr. President, this is just the beginning. The Council must continue to be actively engaged on this file in order to protect civilians, especially the most vulnerable, including women and the disabled as well as children, prevent the conflict from spreading, and ultimately bring durable peace and stability to the region, which can only be achieved through a two-state solution. We also need to keep in mind various aspects, including WPS. Japan will work tirelessly to these ends. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Switzerland welcomes the adoption of this resolution. This first step by the Council comes belatedly as we deplore the victims of Hamas's terrorist attacks and the deaths of thousands of civilians in Israel and throughout the occupied Palestinian territory since the 7th of October, including very many children. I would like to thank the Maltese delegation for its efforts to reach a consensus within this Council. Switzerland recognizes Israel's right to ensure its defense and security. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Their captivity in Gaza in appalling conditions for more than a month is unjustifiable, as were the acts of terror and indiscriminate attacks perpetrated by Hamas against Israeli civilians since the 7th of October. Switzerland most firmly condemns these terrorist attacks. We will continue to work towards pursuing the Council's work on the draft resolution of the 10 elected members, which addresses the situation as a whole and to which much effort has been devoted in recent weeks. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mozambique wishes to appreciate the effort made by Malta that led to the adoption of this resolution and hopefully a step towards the end of the death and destruction both in Gaza and Israel. Mozambique is convinced that this resolution is an important step towards mitigating the suffering of civilians in Gaza. However, we are mindful that this resolution does not address the fundamentals of the humanitarian crisis prevailing in the Gaza Strip. In supporting this resolution, Mozambique wants to associate herself with the collective efforts aimed at ensuring the protection of civilians, especially children, in full compliance with the international human rights law and international humanitarian law. An immediate, durable, and sustained cessation of hostilities and a return to the constructive dialogue remain the best immediate alternative to the situation in Gaza. Mr. President, Mozambique reiterates its national position that Israel and Palestine can only resolve their differences through peace and dialogue. It is our strong conviction that the brotherly peoples of Israel and Palestine deserve and can live side by side in security and peaceful coexistence in strict respect for the decision and the resolution of the Security Council. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you for your statement. Now I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Malta for their efforts and their continued engagement with all the Security Council members to come to this point. No one needs reminding that dealing with issues of peace and security, ensuring protection of civilians and supporting peace efforts are the raison d'etre of the Security Council. And when civilians are harmed anywhere in the world, the Council cannot stay idle. Its inability during the last 6 weeks to find common ground on this issue, speak with one voice in condemning the abhorrent terrorist acts and deliver while the humanitarian situation in Gaza has gone from bad to worse, has been particularly distressing. The world has been watching and waiting and hoping. Needless to say, therefore, that we welcome the adoption of today's resolution and its primary focus on international humanitarian law. We voted in favor because the text, imperfect as it is, responds to critical core objectives coherent with our principled position on the issue. It calls for the immediate release of the hostages, which should be released immediately and unconditionally. It provides for extended humanitarian pauses to ensure protection of civilians, in particular children, in accordance with international humanitarian law, for the immediate and unhindered flow of the humanitarian aid to all those in need, as well as for the protection of UN and humanitarian personnel who, let's not forget, have paid a heavy undue price. It is a strong message of hope and solidarity with those suffering. We regret nonetheless that the text fails to issue a clear, strong, and straightforward condemnation of Hamas and its terrorist acts. We need to face the truth. The death toll among Palestinian civilians, including children and women, is unbearable and unjustified. This death toll spiral must stop, since civilians are paying for nothing. Civilians don't deserve to suffer. They don't deserve to die. They need always to be protected. But let's not forget and lose sight that Hamas is directly responsible for the situation. They are responsible of the choices they've deliberately made to invest in tunnels and weapons and terror instead of working for the good of people they pretend to represent. They haven't continued to use civilians as human shields, which has always been a preferred method of warfare by terrorist organizations. But despite this, for the sake of children and other innocent civilians and their safety, in the name of life and future, bound by the unwavering commitment to respect international law and the protection of civilians, we voted in favor because human life should be placed above everything else. We sincerely hope that this moment marks a turning point to start projecting convincingly a Gaza without Hamas, without terror, without war and violence, but with people, normal people, who can project their future in freedom and dignity. And I thank you.
I thank you. Now I give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the adoption of a Security Council resolution on the horrific humanitarian and hostage crisis unfolding in Gaza and Israel is certainly to be welcome. It was long overdue. A response by this body, commensurate with the gravity of the situation, was urgent since day one, that is, more than 5 weeks ago. It was urgent not only to avoid further violence against civilians and widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure, but also to restore some of the Council's credibility. It has been a long, a painful process, as we all know. I thank the delegation of Malta and others, especially through their flexibility, for helping us conclude what we hope is only a first step in the Council's deliberations on this matter. Before the text adopted today, More comprehensive and timely resolutions have been attempted, including one presented by Brazil. Successive vetoes, the specter of pocket vetoes, or the lack of a real negotiating process have prevented them. As the Council repeatedly failed, the General Assembly acted on 27th October. Its resolution called for the protection of civilians and respect for international humanitarian law in Gaza, as well as an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce leading to a cessation of hostilities. Such measures have been and continue to be supported by many member states, including Brazil. We echo the Secretary General's call for a humanitarian ceasefire. Unfortunately, the resolution we have just adopted falls short of these bold but necessary steps. We do hope that if truly and urgently implemented, today's decision will at least mitigate the dreadful situation we have before us. More than 11,000 Palestinians have been killed in the Gaza Strip. The number of dead children is shamefully appalling. 1.5 million Palestinians have been forcibly displaced in mere 1 month. Hospitals and schools have been destroyed, damaged, or rendered useless. The Al-Shifa hospital was raided today, putting hundreds of sick and wounded in extreme danger. Hundreds of thousands in Gaza lack or do not have adequate provision of water, electricity, medical supplies, or shelter. Hundreds of foreigners continue to be prevented from leaving the region. The number of humanitarian workers killed has risen to more than 100, the highest in any conflict in the history of the United Nations. More than 200 hostages of several nationalities have not been released, and humanitarian access to them continues to be denied. All these violations of international humanitarian law must stop now, for all civilians, Palestinians, and Israelis alike. They have been paying the price for decades of systematic denial of the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination. The establishment of a viable Palestinian state living side by side with Israel within secure, mutually accepted, and internationally recognized borders is the only possible solution. Lasting peace must be the ultimate goal for all. Brazil hopes that the Council will truly and functionally remain seized of this matter. Our voice will be strong and fearless in insisting on that. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you. Now, I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. President, the Russian Federation abstained during the vote on the draft resolution put forward by Malta. We could not fail to react to the appeals, including from countries of the region, to the Security Council of the UN to adopt some kind of humanitarian product. This is the only reason why we chose to disregard the many deficiencies of the text. The main one is a lack of a call to an immediate ceasefire. This was and remains the top imperative. Any humanitarian actions require an immediate end to fighting. It is impossible to clear up collapsed buildings or evacuate people under shelling. It's impossible to bring in the much needed fuel, without which electrical energy will soon run out in Gaza hospitals. Furthermore, without supplies of fuel in the next few hours, according to estimates by UNRWA on the 16th of November, the inhabitants of the enclave will be without any communication, without internet, and completely isolated from the outside world. We will have no idea what is going on there. The Gaza Strip will sink into complete darkness and chaos, and coordination among emergency services will be disrupted. And right now, as delegations of the Security Council are practicing their eloquence, the Russian army is, the Israeli army is storming the Al-Shifa hospital and is shelling UNRWA schools. we're hearing worrisome reports about executions of medical personnel, destruction of stores with medical equipment and medication. Once again, I want to stress humanitarian pauses are not and cannot be a replacement for a ceasefire or even a truce. This is just a temporary pause after which military activities will be renewed with greater force. In other words, people who will be evacuated will find themselves under new shelling, and civilian infrastructure will continue to be destroyed, and there will be new victims, more and more victims. We'd like to draw your attention to the fact that just today the Mission of Palestine circulated a letter to the Security Council with a demand for an immediate ceasefire. Mr. President, from the very beginning of the current escalation in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the delegation of the United States has sabotaged any attempts to develop a balanced and depoliticized document aimed at adopting realistic and urgent steps to de-escalate the situation. Our American colleagues in the Council justified the collective punishment and destruction of Palestinians, first and foremost the civilian population, under the pretext of fighting against terrorism and the right of Israel to self-defense, and in fact have basically paralyzed the work of the main UN organ that supports international peace and security. Washington has consistently rejected draft resolutions that have demanded a humanitarian ceasefire. My U.S. colleague just expressed outrage that the Council cannot condemn the Hamas attack of the 7th of October and criticize those who prevented this. I would like to just remind her of the sequence of events, because it was the United States on the 18th of October that vetoed the draft resolution of Brazil that specifically condemned that act. Russia and the United Kingdom abstained at the time, others voted in favor. So the U.S. can only have itself to blame here. We regret that under pressure from Washington, the language of the resolution has been hollowed out. The Council doesn't even demand that the parties introduce humanitarian pauses, but simply calls on them to do so, which is a mockery of the prerogatives of the Council. Colleagues, it's a disgrace that the Council, which has a uniquely powerful toolbox, including under the Chapter 7 of the Council, could only squeeze out such a weak call. As the old saying goes, the mountain has labored and brought forth a mouse. Now, for many weeks now, all representatives of UN humanitarian agencies and the Secretary General have been calling for a humanitarian ceasefire unanimously. This is precisely the reason why we proposed an amendment to the draft. For this purpose, we are extremely disappointed that it was not adopted. Some are not concerned about the effectiveness of the reaction of the Council. The main thing is to say that the Council, so to speak, adopted something that was humanitarian. We have very serious concerns that the provisions of this resolution will not be implemented on the ground. Who will give approval for humanitarian pauses? Who will monitor and verify them? And what will be the consequences of them not being complied with? So the document we've adopted will not contribute to overcoming the humanitarian crisis that the Gaza Strip finds itself in and its population is suffering. We expect that the Secretary General at the next meeting of the Security Council on the Middle Eastern peace process will report on the implementation of this resolution and will provide as soon as possible to the Council options for creating a mechanism of international monitoring over this process. The Council will need to make a decision on further steps, what observers to send to the conflict area, which UN contingent will be involved. We will be carefully monitoring this, and we will not allow this issue to be hushed up or swept under the carpet. But the absolute priority is the adoption of a fully fledged, strong product of the Council with an unequivocal appeal or call to an immediate ceasefire. And we hope that work on this will begin the nearest future. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, the UAE welcomes the adoption of today's resolution, the first one on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict since 2016. It is crucial that this body has come together today around the urgent need to protect civilians, especially children. We recognize that this vote and this outcome was only possible after difficult negotiations and compromises made on all sides. And as the Arab member, we want to again recognize Malta's leadership, but also the commitment by each and every council member to this product. Over the past week, I've seen us all work together across our geographical divides in a way that made this moment possible, and I thank you for that. I believe lives will be saved because of this work. However, I want to emphasize that the adoption of today's resolution only begins our response to this war and to this crisis. Too much time has passed, too many people have been killed, and too much destruction has been wrought. It is worth noting here that where Hamas is not operating, Palestinians are also losing their lives on land internationally recognized as part of their future state. During this period, this last 40 days, and largely underreported, almost 200 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank as a result of settler violence and raids. This must stop, and Israel must hold those committing these attacks fully accountable. For the UAE, this resolution will enable our efforts, our humanitarian efforts on the ground. For example, to receive 1,000 Palestinian children and their families for medical treatment in the UAE. And that work has already begun, and we hope to receive the first group within the coming week. It will also be vital for our establishment of an emergency field hospital in the Gaza Strip. We urge all member states, as well as UN and humanitarian organizations, to utilize this resolution in their efforts to scale up assistance and to come back to the Council if they need additional support. It is vital that this body now lives up to its responsibility towards also ensuring its implementation in full. International law, especially the rules of war, bind all the parties to this conflict. There can be no equivocation on this point. Israel must cease attacks on civilians and civilian objects. They must uphold the special protections afforded by international law to hospitals and schools, and they must ensure safe and unhindered humanitarian access. In this context, we reiterate our condemnation of Israel's raid on the Al-Shifa hospital in the last 24 hours and other attacks on hospitals, and stress that it is precisely this type of military action that today's resolution rejects. Hospitals are sacrosanct spaces that must be protected. We've all received countless unbearable messages of despair from medical workers in these hospitals who have stayed and are pleading for their patients to be protected. Mr. President, if the parties violate this resolution, we expect and we will work to ensure that the Security Council steps in to support its implementation. But looking ahead and beyond working towards a more permanent ceasefire, the Security Council collectively and individually must prioritize resolving this conflict. Over the last decade, there have been increasingly vocal warnings and signs that the two-state solution is on its deathbed. What emerges from the ruins of Gaza may be our last chance to save it. But it will need all of us to continue working together like we have done here today to resurrect it. The fate of peace and security in our region is a shared responsibility and not the burden of a few. For Israel, for the Palestinians, the brutal logic that the occupation has forced on its victims and its perpetrators over the long history of this conflict has really brought us to this desperate point of crisis. The fact is, Israel does have an absolute right to security and peace, free from the attacks that we saw on the 7th of October, but so does a future Palestine. Israel's security, genuine and lasting, will remain elusive if it's built on the continued denial of the Palestinian people's inalienable right to self-determination. Any policy that seeks to obscure that fact is doomed to failure. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the UAE. I will now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of China.
Colleagues, 40 days after the outbreak of the new round of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the Security Council adopted its first resolution focusing on humanitarian concerns and highlighting the protection of children. Malta, the United Arab Emirates, and other members have done a great deal of work in this regard, which China appreciates. China has always supported all efforts aimed at promoting a ceasefire and an end to the fighting and restoring peace. We welcome any initiative conducive to the protection of civilians and the easing of humanitarian crisis. Proceeding from this position, we supported the draft resolution submitted by the Arab countries to the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly, supported the draft resolutions not long ago submitted by Russia and Brazil at the Security Council, and we just voted in favor of the draft resolution submitted by Malta. Meanwhile, it should also be pointed out that the Council should have adopted a more comprehensive and robust resolution much earlier. For reasons known to all, in particular, the repeated and persistent obstruction of a permanent member of the Council, this resolution at present can only serve as a first step based on minimum consensus. Despite this, the resolution is still of positive significance as an initial step towards a ceasefire and a minimum request to save lives, which helps avert a greater humanitarian crisis and catastrophe. We look forward to the immediate realization of durable humanitarian pauses, as called for in the resolution, to ensure a sufficient number of days of cessation of hostilities to allow UN humanitarian agencies, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and others to carry out full-scale humanitarian operations to urgently search for and rescue missing children, to transfer and treat the seriously ill and seriously injured, and to rehabilitate critical infrastructure. We express our grave concern and strong opposition to the clear violations of international humanitarian law taking place in Gaza. Over the past dozens of hours, Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza has been under siege, operating rooms and wards bombarded, and premature babies stopped breathing in incubators with electricity being cut off. Thousands of people remain besieged in the hospital. Their safety and well-being are worrisome. We urge Israel to immediately cease its military operations against civilian facilities, including hospitals, and to restore basic supplies of water, electricity, fuel, among others, as soon as possible. We would like to reiterate that we are strongly against the arbitrary displacement of the Palestinian people. The resolution just adopted also makes a clear call on the issue related to hostages. We reiterate our call to guarantee the personal security and humanitarian needs of the hostages, and to support active diplomatic efforts to facilitate the early release of the persons concerned. The utility of Council resolutions lies in the implementation. The key is for the parties concerned to implement the provisions of the resolution to the letter. In this regard, Russia's concerns about monitoring and follow-up are legitimate. It is necessary for the Security Council to consider it and consider establishing a monitoring mechanism and designate a specialized body to verify implementation and submit timely reports to the Council. Colleagues, on November 11th, at the joint Arab-Islamic Extraordinary Summit, leaders from countries called on the Security Council to take a decisive and binding decision to end the fighting in Gaza and put an end to the violations of international law. This represents the strong voice of the regional countries and the common expectations of the international community. The Council must assume its responsibility in conjunction with the developments on the ground and take further meaningful and responsible actions in a timely manner. We must continue to make an immediate ceasefire an overriding priority in order to prevent further casualties and destruction as the fighting rages on. We must make the opening of humanitarian space a priority, clearing the way for adequate humanitarian supplies to enter Gaza and creating the conditions necessary for humanitarian agencies to operate in a safe and unhindered manner. We must take the revitalization of the prospects for a two-state solution as the way forward and galvanize diplomatic efforts to promote a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution to the question of Palestine. China would like to emphasize that any arrangement on the future of Gaza must respect the will and the independent choices of the Palestinian people. Colleagues, war tests conscience and justice, while peace calls for reason and wisdom. On issues bearing on war and peace and on the long-term peace and security of the Middle East, the Security Council must stand on the side of justice and make choices that stand the test of history and time. As President of the Security Council for this month, China will continue to work with all parties to strengthen coordination, build consensus, and urge the Security Council to shoulder its due responsibilities. I now resume my function as President of the Council.
Malta has requested the floor for a further statement. I give you the floor.
Thank you, President. It is just a short statement to say that following the adoption of United Nations Security Council Resolution 2712, I would like to thank all Council members for their constructive engagement with us throughout this entire process. As I said in my statement before the vote, with this adoption today, the Security Council reaffirmed its responsibility and commitment to the safeguarding of civilian lives, especially those of children. Malta will continue to actively engage on the situation in Israel and Gaza. What we have achieved today is an important first step. We will remain steadfast in our commitment to the protection of civilians and the plight of children in armed conflict that continue to suffer in a disproportionate manner throughout our term on the Council as an elected member. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, Gaza bleeds, death, devastation, destructions everywhere. No one was spared, not our children, not our women, not our elderly, not our civilians. Nothing was spared, not our hospitals, not the UN shelters and schools, not our water plants, not our homes. All that should have been protected has become the primary target of this murderous campaign. The Security Council should have called for a ceasefire a long time ago. It should have called for a ceasefire now. It should have heeded the call by the UN and every humanitarian organization on earth calling for a humanitarian ceasefire, including the Secretary General of the United Nations. It should have been convinced that there is no military solution, especially one that relies on the commission of atrocities, and it should have advanced political ones. The Council is finally acting today on a humanitarian resolution focused on children. if we are going to talk about the condemnations missing from the resolution, let me remind you of the following. But before I do that, I just want to inform you that the Foreign Ministry of the State of Israel rejected this resolution adopted a few minutes ago and said they will not implement it and they will continue with their course of action as they wish. What are you going to do? You just adopted a resolution. They told you we are not going to implement it. Let me remind you of the following. The resolution did not condemn the killing by Israel of 11,000 Palestinians, overwhelmingly civilians, including 5,000 Palestinian children. Let me repeat, 5,000 Palestinian children. It did not condemn the indiscriminate attacks by Israel. It did not condemn the assault on hospitals and schools. It did not condemn the killing by Israel of UN staff, journalists, humanitarian personnel, doctors, rescue teams. It does not condemn the arbitrary imprisonment of thousands of Palestinians, men, women, and children, nor call for their immediate and unconditional release. The resolution did not condemn the racist and disgusting Israeli propaganda methods mocked around the world and which constitute an insult to our intelligence. They are, however, still echoed by some politicians and media at the expense of their own credibility. Selective outrage breeds double standards and shows disregard for Palestinian life and refusal to recognize Israeli crimes that are undeniable. The resolution in its OP1 demands that all parties comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, notably with regard to the protection of civilians, especially children. We are fully committed to these rules, all of them. But do they apply to Israel? Is it heeding this demand? You have been calling on Israel now for 40 days to uphold the laws of war, and it has chosen to continue breaching them openly and brazenly. I should even say you have been demanding from Israel to respect international law for decades, and it has dismissed your calls and continued its crimes against the Palestinian people. Did you ever hold it accountable? Are you going to hold it accountable for rejecting your resolution you adopted this afternoon? Nothing justifies war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Nothing. And there is no honor in defending Israel when it is committing such crimes. Only shame. The bombings and incursions must stop now. Humanitarian aid must come in now, not drop by drop, just to pretend that the criminal siege has been lifted, but effectively bringing it to an end. Fuel must come in now. Thousands of lives, millions of lives hang in the balance. Our hospitals have been destroyed. Our people have no food or clean water. God sent them rain while you were still trying to get Israel to let fuel in to allow water pumps to function. This madness must be brought to an end. The moment the bombs stop, we will see results, saving lives, allowing humanitarian aid in, rescuing the thousands under the rubble, the Palestinian children under the rubble, and burying all those who we could have saved for days now and who died, alone, under the rubble, shouting for help, and there was no help coming forth. It will allow to release those held captive, the resolution. It will allow to repair the civilian infrastructure that is needed for the survival of our people. It will allow to help the wounded and sick. The primary goal of international humanitarian law is to protect the civilians, the wounded and the sick. In Gaza, those are the ones who suffer most from the Israeli assault. What is happening will have long-term effects that no one should underestimate. It is a failure of humanity of terrifying magnitude. Let me repeat, it is a failure of humanity of terrifying magnitude. But for now, the urgency is to save lives, stop the killing, stop the forced displacement, allow humanitarian aid in and ensure humanitarian access, protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. These should not be words in a resolution. They should be a reality that our people on the ground witness immediately. Finally, I have to address the following for those who are still trying to maintain untenable positions. 1, Israel is effectively telling you it can kill any and every Palestinian without ever being responsible for their death, as they are either terrorist sympathizers, or human shield. Anyone allowing such a logic to prevail is contributing to the killing. Israel considers all of us terrorists. All our factions, our NGOs, our human rights defenders. It is acting accordingly. 3, Israel is not under threat of destruction. It is destroying Palestine. It considers the Palestinian state as a strategic threat. It is against Palestinian rule anywhere. All its policies are designed to undermine any such rule. 4, the plan of this Israeli government, the current government, has now been revealed in statements, leaked memos, op-eds. Let us stop pretending we don't hear what this government is saying. Its plan is the continued dispossession, displacement, and denial of rights of the Palestinian people to complete the Nakba that started in 1948. Recognizing that is the first step to defeat such plans, which not only deny our people their rights, but also deny the region any chance for shared peace and security. What is happening in Gaza cannot be read in isolation of these goals. Ceasefire now, and no further delay for international action for freedom, justice, and peace. There is an alternative reality in which Palestinians are free, and no Palestinian and no Israeli is killed. It is time for it to prevail. It is time for peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you. I thank the permanent observer of the Palestine observer state. I now give the floor to Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished council members, we have all been here before. Israel has made her stance very clear, and thus I will be brief. This Council has just adopted a resolution that is regretfully detached from the reality on the ground. Israel commends the Council for calling for the immediate and unconditional release of the 239 hostages, yet sadly, this resolution falls on deaf ears when it comes to Hamas and other terrorist organizations. On the 7th of October, savage Hamas terrorists launched a barbaric invasion into Israel, murdering, raping, and brutalizing innocent civilians. Nearly 6 weeks have passed. This Council has convened on the matter almost 10 times and still has not succeeded in condemning Hamas's October 7th massacre. The resolution focuses solely on the humanitarian situation in Gaza, yet makes no mention of what led up to this moment. The resolution makes it seem as if what we are witnessing in Gaza happened of its own accord. Following Hamas's reprehensible pogrom, Hamas has made it abundantly clear that if given the chance, they will commit such atrocities again and again. They have shown the world that their genocidal rhetoric is not hyperbole, but an oath to annihilate Israel by any means. Therefore, in order to defend our future, Israel had to take action. Israel's mission, as we've stated clearly before, is to eliminate Hamas's capabilities. This is not about retaliation or revenge for Hamas's violence. It is Israel's upholding her right to self-defense and ensuring that such horrors are never repeated. It is the fulfillment of our collective oath of never again. Council members, Israel is a law-abiding democracy, strictly operating in accordance with international law. Hamas, on the other hand, is a jihadist organization hell-bent on Israel's destruction through the targeting of Israeli civilians and the use of Gazan civilians as human shields. Hamas is the antithesis of an organization that abides by international law. Hamas will pay no heed to the words of this Council. Despite this Council's intentions, Hamas does not care for your resolutions or your demands. Israel has already implemented daily tactical humanitarian pauses during which Gazan civilians can temporarily evacuate the active war zone. Hamas, on the other hand, murders Gazans as they try to evacuate. As of today, Israel has approved the entry of nearly 1,400 trucks with thousands of tons worth of aid. Meanwhile, Hamas is hoarding food, fuel, and medical supplies for its terror machine, leaving Gazan civilians with nothing. For weeks, Israel has called for the temporary evacuation of all hospitals in northern Gaza in order to mitigate casualties and safeguard civilian lives. Yet Hamas forcefully holds Gazan civilians in hospitals in order to continue using them as human shields. Hospitals have become fortified Hamas military bases. Yesterday, Israel supplied neonatal incubators and medical supplies to Al-Shifa Hospital, and Israel is in close contact with international organizations regarding the construction of field hospitals. Just 2 days ago, Israel, at great risk to our soldiers' lives, hand-delivered 300 liters of fuel to Al-Shifa Hospital. Hamas prevented the hospital staff from accepting it. There is no clearer proof that Israel is doing everything possible to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza, while Hamas is doing everything possible to make it worse. Council members, increasing the suffering of Gazan civilians is an integral part of Hamas's vicious strategy. Hamas's goal is to intensify and deteriorate the humanitarian situation in Gaza in order to broadcast Palestinian hardship to the world, and by doing so, exploit this very body to tie Israel's hands. Hamas is solely responsible for the humanitarian situation in Gaza, and they have weaponized it to prevent Israel from defending itself. Israel does not need a resolution to remind us to adhere to international law. Israel always adheres to international law. Hamas, the party that will refuse to accept this resolution, will not even bother reading it. Hence, this resolution does nothing to contribute to the situation on the ground. Bringing our hostages home is Israel's top priority, and seeing as Security Council resolutions hold no sway with terrorists, Israel will continue to do whatever it takes to accomplish this goal. Mr. President, as much as we all wish to believe that this resolution and this Council could have an impact on genocidal terrorists, the situation on the ground proves otherwise. The reality is that Israel has no choice but to continue with our mission to obliterate Hamas's capabilities and bring our hostages home. Should Hamas choose to lay down their arms, turn themselves in, and hand over the hostages unscathed, this war would end immediately. Sadly, this is not Hamas's modus operandi. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.